And to the right is Nick Taylor, Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast, a nonprofit organization that works with communities in the Greater Seacoast region and against diverse housing options through technical assistance, education, and engagement. Prior to joining the coalition, Nick worked at the Newmarket Town on a range of policy initiatives. So I've got a good softball to start off. So for both of you, what is your housing story and how does it impact your life?
Thank you. So in other words, like, where have we lived?
Where have you lived and how do you think it has affected your life?
Great question. Well, it's really nice to be here with all you guys tonight, and I'm glad you came out on this October evening to talk about this. It clearly is an issue that Newmarket is interested in. So good topic. I always like it. So my housing story is interesting. I mean, I grew up in Stratham in sort of a cul-de-sac. We rode bikes around our circle, and there was a little sort of like creek on the far side where we would catch rods and go exploring in the woods, and that was sort of a place that gave us like a peaceful place for exploration. So I guess that's my first housing story. I went to college at Dartmouth, and I was in the Peace Corps, so I lived overseas in Senegal, West Africa for 2.5 years. Family where it was like multi-generational. There were probably 6 or 7 kids. Husband and wife and grandma. We all ate together in this sort of home. We sat on the floor, but we were sort of right in town, so we could walk around and be part of the community. I lived in New York and DC, so I did kind of the urban thing, and that's always hard. I think it gives you great access to walkability. Hard to get everywhere, but sort of easier to get everywhere at the same time. And then in Portsmouth, I've had the good fortune to live in a walkable place, and I think that's impacted me the most. My little kids, I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and we live in our stroller. And so I feel really lucky that as a mom, I can take them now post-COVID to the grocery store. Maybe not post-COVID, but in between COVID, to the grocery store, and we can just kind of pop over to the playground or do something that allows them to be hungry. So I don't know if that's what you meant, but that's sort of been my housing journey, and my wife and I will be forever locked in a housing journey because I would live in the middle of nowhere. My wife would live in the middle of downtown, so I think we'll always find an interesting place to live.
Yeah. Thanks, Senator. Thanks, Bart. And thank you all for coming out. This is so exciting to see so many people come out for a community conversation on, like the Senator said, just the evening, weekday evening, night, just to talk about this. And I think it does show how important this issue is for so many in New Hampshire. So, similar situation where I grew up in kind of the traditional single-family home in Massachusetts. So I always tell people Massachusetts by birth, but New Hampshire by choice. And then rented for a number of places in Manchester. And so I was living, kind of bumping around, depending on the roommate situation, what we could find that was, within our budget right after college, figuring out how do we make ends meet when I was trying to, pay our utility costs, or all these things that, as you're growing up, and at least in my family, wasn't something I didn't have to really worry about. So bumped around to a couple different rental units in Manchester before ending up in a single-family home that I was able to buy right before COVID. So I got really lucky, and I do talk to my siblings and friends who are struggling right now as they're seeing some of the mortgage rates go up and the lack of affordability during COVID as people were flooding out of these cities, driving down our rental vacancy rates and driving up our home prices and down the inventory. So it is really interesting, and I really like the question around the life cycle, because you're talking about, really is a life cycle, right? It's where you raising your kids, but then right after college or right after as you're entering the workforce, where are you living, and then where are you raising your family, and then thinking about seniors who are looking to downsize and stay in their communities. And so, we always talk about sort of the workforce housing piece of this, but it really is a whole life cycle and a balanced housing market that allows everybody to be able to live in Newmarket or live where they want to live, whether you're a kid going to school or whether you're a senior trying to stay in your community. I really like the question there, and I think I've still got a couple chapters left to write in my housing life cycle, hopefully, but that's what it's been so far.
Thank you. Yeah, with that, that's your story. What other stories are you hearing out there from people from their housing perspective? In your communities, what is most concerning to them at this point? Is it the affordability? Is the amount, of the lack thereof of housing options? What are you seeing out there right now?
Yeah.
Go to Nick first.
Yeah, I mean, we hear a lot about the lack of supply, and that's both the rental unit supply and the for-purchase supply. And we hear it from a lot of business owners, right? Is that they're trying to find workers to work, be able to fully staff their restaurant, right? It's like when you go into a restaurant now and you're seeing empty tables, it's not because of COVID precautions, it's because they can't find the staff to do a full meal service or full, whether it's back in the front, back of the house or front of the house. You hear from manufacturers that say, I'd love to do a third shift, but I can't because we can't find the workers because there's nowhere for them to live. And so we certainly hear it from employees, and then we also hear it from everyday people who are coming up and trying to find, maybe they accepted a great job that they're so excited about, but they can't find a place that's within 30 minutes of the community they want to live in. Or you have people that are, I get phone calls all the time, and it's really heartbreaking where people are saying my rent just went up by hundreds of dollars. I can't afford that. I might be on a fixed income or just with the salary and the hourly wages that I make, I can't work enough overtime to make that leap. What can I do? And the unfortunate thing for us is so often we say, this is a story we hear a lot, all too often, and that there's not really an easy answer. If I could just direct you, I'd love to direct you to this apartment building that has a bunch of beautiful open units that you can call and you can get them, that are affordable to you, but it's not the case. It's so often it's like, well, I can try and help you scrap through Facebook to see if someone posted that they have an ADU available in their backyard, but it's like, it really is come to that. And so, we hear it from all sides, whether it's the workers, the workforce, the business owners, or people that are looking to move in, and really all ages too.
Yeah. I would say that echoes my experience, and I was just thinking about sort of, you were talking about life cycle, like how we've sort of seen this issue progress. I got involved in politics in the first place, if you want to call it that. I ran for city council on the issue of zoning changes, so everybody else was kind of talking about, maybe more exciting issues in town, but I was like, I want to talk about zoning, and I got elected, and in my first 2 years as a Perkins city councilor, we put zoning changes through. We formed a housing committee at my request. I chaired it. We produced recommendations about where in the city would sort of respect, the neighborhood quality and sort of the community of Portsmouth, and settled on the fact that in our single-story commercial plazas, so places like the old Kmart Plaza or where Planet Fitness is, that there was an opportunity not only to build floors of housing above that single-story commercial, but potentially also to build out those parking lots. If it was going to be a different use inside the lot, did we really need the same kind of parking for that entire lot? And so I remember always there was this older gentleman on HDC at the time, and he showed me this scale drawing he had done, and he took the entirety of downtown Portsmouth and he overlaid it over the bowl around the plaza. And from the new golf place or Tuscan Kitchen to what is now, I think, Harbor Freight, whatever that business is on the end that keeps changing, the entirety of downtown Portsmouth fit in that parking lot. And so it was really eye-opening for me because, the reality is that we could fit hundreds, if not thousands, of housing units in that area. We could fit a walkable downtown, we could fit an interesting civic place. It was really sort of up to us to imagine, what did we want this to be for our city? And that didn't mean it would change right away, right? But it could potentially change in 8 or 10 or 15 years. And so it was up to us to kind of see that vision and write the words on the page and draw the drawings in our zoning ordinance, to kind of make that happen. And so, this might feel slightly off topic, but I guess part of it is because when I got involved in 2015, what people were telling me in Portsmouth was, people are moving to Dover. Like, they're not gonna keep coming back down to Portsmouth to add to your diversity or to add to your cultural life. And now I think people can't even be part of our Seacoast community, and I know there's been a lot of turbulence in Newmarket that I've heard a lot about in the last few months where, we're losing people whose lives are based here, and that's not just where you live, it's your work commute, it's your daycare commute, it's the school your kids go to, it's everything, it's your whole routine. So I think, it's continued to get worse, unfortunately, but that doesn't mean that all is lost. I think that, like Nick said, we hear from businesses all the time who have really realized the urgency of this issue and are getting involved politically in ways that they haven't before. And I think that many are starting to realize that this isn't just an issue that affects young people just starting out or people that can't afford housing yet. It really affects all of us. It affects our economic vitality and diversity and sort of richness as a community to keep a variety of people here. So yes, unfortunately I hear from a lot of different people, but I feel a very growing momentum around understanding the gravity of this issue politically.
Yeah, and I would just echo, I think that's, from what we've heard, there's been this sort of groundswell of okay, this is a real, for a while we're kind of beating the drum of saying this is about to be a problem, this is starting to be a problem. And now you're hearing more and more people come and say, okay, you got, I agree with you.
Yeah.
What can we do about it? And that's been both encouraging because now we can start to talk about solutions, and as long as we're getting to the place of, okay, well let's talk about solutions, that's a lot better than trying to educate someone that it's even an issue, but it still means that there's a long way to go, and we need more people that are excited about running on zoning, getting involved.
I want to follow up on that solutions. It sounds like we went through a great process in the rezoning effort. So can you identify some attributes to that process being so successful? And same thing in Munich, I think you're in a couple of processes right now for housing coalitions or commissions. Local in municipalities. So where can you draw? Are there common attributes that help positive momentum moving forward? They can maybe share.
Yeah, sure.
And me too.
So it took a lot of time. It took a lot of hours. It took a lot of thought. It took just a lot of events, a lot of thinking about sort of how can we have enough conversation in our community that we really do feel comfortable with these zoning changes, and how can we run a committee, how can I chair the housing committee in a way that can avoid it becoming a really politically sensitive issue, how can we make everyone feel included in this process. So I would say some of the things I felt like went well were that I spent a lot of time focused on that piece, that communication piece. I didn't want to just run the public process. I wanted to make sure all of our housing stakeholders were involved and communicating through their network. So that was the genesis of the Housing Huddle, which was, we met bi-weekly, and it was the homeless shelter folks, it was the workforce housing folks, it was the senior housing folks, it was placemaking, it was architects, it was city planners, it was sort of the whole built environment community agreeing that more housing stock was not the only answer for everybody, but it was part of the answer for everybody. And so, we sort of came together in that way. So I think having those two things kind of working together was really helpful to me as the elected because, it was my job to make sure my constituents were happy with what was going on. And the housing stakeholders, wanted to support the process because it was the kind of change that advanced their issues. So there was some really good symbiosis there. I would say another thing we did that felt good and felt successful was trying to do as much visual stuff as we could. I think a lot of times public processes are so exciting, and full of public minutes and meetings on local TV. And so we tried to present, like put up the zoning map and like put squares on it where we were thinking about and say, we're looking for feedback on these, or present pictures of, the kind of housing or like mixed use development that could eventuate from our zoning. And to that end, one of the things we actually did, which was a ton of fun, was we invited the local architects to envision, like, if the words on the page were passed into law, what could some of these spaces look like? And they had a blast with it. I mean, that was like a chance for them to kind of like flex their creative muscles. It was a chance for us to see in Portsmouth like the talent we have locally, but most importantly, I think it really allowed people to sort of get comfortable with what we were trying to do because they could see it, So those are some things that went well. I would say, things we learned in retrospect, like when the zoning changes passed, they were not, like, there was almost no public discussion by the end of the 2-year process. So that's when you're doing stuff well, right? Nobody's yelling at you. But, I think, like, then in retrospect, after they were passed, I wish we had been even more intentional about ensuring that, like, abutters or owners of those parcels really, like, actually came to our meetings. We notified them, invited them, but they're the most affected by the changes that would take place. And so there wasn't any big objection, but there were a couple of folks who kind of came and said, well, I wouldn't use it the way you drafted it. And it's like, well, I really wish you were here to tell us that during this whole 2 years. I've been saying, everybody come tell me what you would like here, and then there was one person, one neighborhood that was kind of not comfortable with how dense it ended up, and it was near them, it wasn't in the neighborhood, but I think it sort of led me to this conclusion, like, no communication is too much. There's always someone else you can be communicating to, and I think just trying to use all the tools you have available to you, whether that's the city newsletter, the newspaper, events, social media, like stakeholders, their newsletters, through all that, I feel like we were able to tip the scale in terms of getting the community comfortable. But I think like anything short of that, may not have been enough. So it's a big one. But, yeah.
No, I totally agree. From working in a number of different communities in our sort of catchment area, we cover Rockingham and Stratford counties. It's that community engagement is just so important. You need to talk with people and feel, what does the community really want? Because the solution is not the same for everybody, right? Is what Newmarket may want versus Stratham versus Northampton versus Portsmouth versus Dover, like it's not going to be the same, and it shouldn't be, and that's okay, right? And there's both structural differences around access to public water and sewer that some towns have, and sort of community desires and community needs, right? And so that's totally okay. We're never going to have, big multifamily buildings everywhere. And so being able to reach out and do those, use all your tools that the Senator was talking about through public channels, and not just, your planning board or zoning board meeting, because that's not really always a cross-section of your entire community, right? It's people that have the flexibility, the ability to show up in an evening for hours and hours of public testimony. If you're a single parent with 2 kids, like, you're not going to necessarily be able to bring your kids to that meeting and sit through and tell your story, but you're just as much a part of the community as someone that might be able to sit through that and testify in front of a committee. So using different tools, and we try and do that and encourage communities to do that, whether that's like going to having a conversation like this, or doing some of the formal channels, or bringing a speaker into town to talk, or doing outreach, going to areas that are high traffic or high public engagement, and being able to actually have some conversations with people, because you do need to have that buy-in, you need to have that community engagement, and that allows your policymakers to be able to put something forward that works. And nothing is unanimous. We're never going to be in a situation where everybody agrees on everything, but you do have a product that you're proud of and that people feel like they had the opportunity to speak on. Because we've always found that when things go really bad, and we've seen things go really bad, it's when somebody just tried to move forward, didn't tell the neighbors, didn't tell anybody that they were going for this, didn't try to even engage people at all. and then you lose trust. And once you lose trust, you can't get it back. It's very, very difficult to get it back. And we're only going to be able to make progress if people trust that their opinion matters, that their policymakers are looking out for them. So that community engagement piece in all different ways, it's just so incredibly important.
Absolutely, and kind of the old adage, what do you call something when no one agrees about anything? Consensus. That's what we're striving for. So speaking of that, both of you have experience at the state house level, and I know there's a lot of policies the past few years, trying to solve this. I think we all agree there's a housing issue, but how do we get there? So I don't know if you can talk about a little insight into Concord and how that process goes, and what are you seeing there, and where do you see it going? Is there going to be any effort legislative season coming up, trying to help us municipalities out? Nick.
I'm happy to start, and Senator, I think you probably have maybe more concrete ideas as someone who actually can put some things forward. But I do think there is broad bipartisan agreement, and the Senator is the co-chair of a bipartisan housing caucus that has leadership, both Democratic and Republican leadership, which is really exciting because there are a lot of hot button issues that do not have that kind of bipartisan agreement, and housing is one that you do see everybody really trying to work together to try and find some way forward and something that works. I don't think we're ever going to be in a position in New Hampshire, we probably shouldn't be, where there's no, the state overtaking local zoning altogether or anything like that. But there's a lot of good resources at the state level, whether it's sort of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund or some of those economies of scale where they're able to make some more resources available to communities to upgrade some of their infrastructure or make grants available. We're seeing this a little bit with this Invest New Hampshire program where there's $5 million that's available to communities for planning and zoning grants, where they're able to access some of those funds to help often overworked and understaffed offices develop, take a look, do an audit of their zoning. Are there things that we could fix that would make a lot of sense, would stay within the character of our communities, but would allow some additional housing units to move forward? And so often in New Hampshire, all the costs are pushed right down to the municipalities, and so having the state be able to leverage some of those dollars to be able to make it a little bit easier for communities to move forward, I think that's a big help. And you made some other specific thoughts.
Yeah, there's so much we can do, but a lot of it is really like empowering you guys locally, And so, like Nick said, there's sort of these financial pieces that I think are they're new with these federal funds that are available. That's never really been a big tool that we've been able to use at the state level. So I'm interested to see where we can go there. I'm hoping we can shape stuff a little better going forward, that, when we have those financial resources, we really can use them to support projects that are graded on like a true multi-pronged scale, like New Hampshire Housing has, and awarded very carefully, and I think that'll help kind of extend our pipeline into the future. But, we did get passed last year a big chunk of SB 400, which was our big sort of like flagship housing bill. And it had been going on for a number of years, and it started on this governor's task force that I was appointed to in 2019 as a city councilor at the time. And we drafted these two bills, 1629 and 1632, in the next legislative session. They got wrapped up in COVID. They didn't make it through the next session, and then last year we combined them into one bill, and we got about 2/3 of that through. So some of the things that I think are good tools that are in there are still a little wonky. They're not necessarily the ones that are the most helpful to towns and cities, but there's things like, making sure that a plaintiff who appeals a local land use decision for a multifamily project, for example, needs to post a bond so that there's some balance in terms of communities being able to actually move these big projects through their pipeline with some certainty for the developer. There's some ability to expand the use of 79E, which is like a zoning tool that, you can kind of use to do village residential. So I'm not gonna go too much into what passed because I think it's helpful on the municipal level. What I still think remains to be done is one bill that I know Portsmouth is likely to ask me on Friday to bring forward, and I'd love to talk to you guys about it to see if you're supportive, but it's one of my babies I've been working on for a number of years, and it's simply enabling municipalities to require income restricted housing units as part of any new construction. And so in Massachusetts, they have what they call Chapter 40B, and in every community across Massachusetts, if a new housing development gets built, a certain percentage of it is required to remain affordable to whatever pegs for local income. In New Hampshire, it would be area median income. In Portsmouth, for example, it would be 60 to 100% of around $65,000 for a family of three. So we have virtually no housing that's available at that price point in Portsmouth. And so if we're going to see new construction, for example, under these zoning changes that got passed, it would be great if Portsmouth were able, if Portsmouth made that choice, to make sure that income restricted units are part of that mix. And in the zoning we did pass, we used sort of an incentive system to try and see some of those units. We said, if you include some of those units and or some green space, then you can build even more units per acre. So if you give us as a city income restricted units, and sorry, I don't want to say income restricted, that's not clear to people what it means. Basically, the unit can be rented at a price that is sort of tied to that income level. So it's priced around what people are bringing home. And that's a covenant that's on, the real property. So it's something that has to be maintained for 10 or 25, or what we're seeing right now is 40 years. And so, we have some of that in place in Portsmouth, but we've seen, first we had 2 income restricted units, and then we had 27 that came online as part of West End Yards, I think. So in all of Portsmouth, which is 10,000 households, we have like 30 units, and we need more than 30. That's not even beginning to do it. So that's it might be a standalone bill I'm thinking about, and then there's another program that I've been trying to get through for a few years, and again, I would welcome feedback from the district on how anything we want to change, but I call it the Housing Champions Program. It was part of SB 400, but it essentially is kind of like a reward system for our cities and towns to have good behavior on housing. And one of the things they can do, obviously, is pass a zoning ordinance that's housing friendly, make changes that are friendly. But other things like Nick was mentioning, planning places where density makes sense and building sewer and water out to those places so that the municipality is kind of supporting, a private developer coming in to build the housing in a place that makes sense for that community. Building sidewalks, bringing public transportation to those locations. So there's a lot of different ways as a community you can support housing that are not just your zoning ordinance. Your zoning ordinance, though, is free. So it's an easy way to do it. And so in return, the state would do what it can do for those communities, which might be like extra points on your state capital improvement plan projects, things you want done that the state will fund, or extra availability of low interest loans like through the revolving loan fund for sewer and water. Real exciting stuff, I know, but these are the things that make the world go around, and I think we've been trying at the state level to just be really creative. How can we insert ourselves into this conversation in a way that supports communities taking that step themselves, because I don't think there's ever a great future in New Hampshire. You can tell me if you feel differently, where the state is mandating zoning or directing areas of density or things like that. However, we do want to support it. And then I'll just mention as the last thing, one of the exciting things I think is going on long term is I just kind of this working group I've been meeting with quarterly, and there's a lot of interesting GIS mapping going on, and so, here I am.
What's GIS mapping?
Here I am with my nerdiness. It's like electronic map data. I don't know, you tell me.
I heard it, geographic information, so it's basically spatial data, so visualizing data.
Yes.
From like a map perspective.
Yeah.
So it's not for
No, it's good. And then basically being able to take that and kind of overlay it in places in the state where we are kind of seeing existing density, or for example, seeing demand for jobs, or seeing a lot of parcels kind of in current use, or, you know, like I think mapping out where public sewer water exists or where these demands are, like, it gives us new tools at the state level to, I don't know, potentially in the future, maybe there's something like an opportunity zone where we can like further incentivize cities and towns to zone in a certain area that makes sense, where like the state can support the infrastructure stuff. There's some exciting stuff happening. I mean, nothing's gonna fix the problem overnight, but we're working on it.
And I think this whole conversation kind of shows one of the main challenges of addressing the housing crisis is that it's really wonky, right? Is that there's so many moving pieces between technical terms, zoning, and then even if you zone something in a way that would allow it, you still need the developers to be able to come in and build things. You need those numbers to work. You need the supply chain pieces of getting the materials there. It's like not one of these policies that you can flip a switch and say, all right, we're just going to raise the level to this, and then it'll happen.
You need the banks to be able to finance it.
Yeah, you need the banks to finance it, and
you need the project timeline to make sense, yeah.
And so then you're trying to go out and sell it, or explain what to do, and it's like, oh my God, there's a whole bunch of terms coming around. It just seems like all of this, and that makes it hard sometimes to build momentum and build a case to get something passed, both state level and locally.
Yeah.
So it would be fair to say we have an information problem, like misunderstanding.
Right.
Like everyone knows what the problem is, but we just don't understand all the pieces, or like, you know, we don't have a common vocabulary, common vernacular. I think that would help a lot in bringing everyone to the table, which requires everyone to the table. So, something maybe you know, if we get some definitions maybe, and moving forward using those, that might, you know, be very useful for everyone just to help understand.
And it doesn't even get into some of the myths that people just like sort of misperceptions about what some housing does with property taxes and what it does to the school system and all of these things that when we know, we can look at the data and, you know, between New Hampshire's declining enrollment and between situations where when you actually add a student or a handful of students to a school, you're not actually, you know, the school building isn't any bigger, you don't have to heat it any hotter, you're not, you know, all those fixed costs don't actually expand. So there's a lot of pushback there too that you still have to go out. So getting past that barrier all the way back to actually what is the solution, you know, just even, it's one more hurdle out there in front of folks.
Right. And this comes to change. Change is hard. So I think we all like kind of one another too, and we, you know, listen to each other as well. That might help you know, solve issues. So speaking of that, I'd like to maybe open up to the audience, and you know, if there's anything they want to say about housing, their experiences, and if there's anything, you know, go ahead and just like you just go to that microphone, that's right in front of you. Yeah. And just say your name and.
Nancy Lambert, I'm from Durham, and I noticed, Senator Kwoka, you said something about parcels that are tied up in current use. And of course, the conservation community, of course, doesn't look at it as tied up parcels. They look at it as conserved parcels, that how we maintain our forests and our open spaces here in New Hampshire. And I'm wondering if you can comment more about that tension between conservation efforts in New Hampshire and housing efforts.
Yeah, and thank you for the question, and thank you for pointing out, you know, that I came at it from my housing angle. But, you know, I think it is, I won't say it's a myth, because you know, I can't speak for everybody, but I know that part of my interest in being involved in all this is that we don't continue to kind of see this perpetuation of inefficient land use. You know, I think that what we really want, and this is my philosophy, but it rings true for me, is like, we really want to return to a community where we do live densely, and we do run into our neighbors, and we do see multi-generational living, you know, and so that kind of density is incredible. incredibly compatible with conservation. And there was this thing called the Housing and Conservation Planning Program that came out of the Housing and Conservation Roundtable back in 2007 and 2008, and it was this really broad-based coalition that kind of looked at like, okay, so we can talk about how these things are compatible, but like, what are the tools to actually put them together? And they came up with some neat innovative land use controls, which is a book about this big, and I say neat, again, showing my huge nerdiness, and it's like, you know, things like a cluster development. So instead of your zoning saying, okay, on this 30-acre parcel, each house must have an acre, and it must have these setbacks, and, you know, it takes up all that land individually. You know, instead, if you can leave 70 or even 80% of that parcel open or build trails on it, you know, and cluster your housing down, then, you know, you can sort of play with that a little bit. You could give incentives, like they could build extra units if, you know, they can leave a certain amount open. So I think there's a lot of those things going together. When I say tied up in current use, I mean, I am talking about the fact that about 30% of our state is in current use. So it is, you know, the lack of land is real, and I think that for my part, I would love to see us do all of this work through infill development. You know, I know that I've thoroughly indoctrinated my wife because we drive up and down like Route 1 in Northampton, and you know, she's going, oh, you can build so much housing there. You know, you can build so much housing there. And I'm like, okay, I've got you. I just need to get everybody else. So I don't think it's our goal, you know, to be like tapping into these conserved lands. At least I can speak for myself. But in that, I think there's a real opportunity for partnership for the conservation community to kind of come and say, all right, like, let's put pressure on unlocking like this sort of infill development, like redeveloping efficient, you know. So at least that's how I think about it. But from the state level, current use comes up, you know, just because it's one of the few levers we have to think about. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I do think, I just said, I think that's a really good point, because one of the things that we hear in this organization, Stay Work Play, which is a statewide organization that looks to attract and retain young people in New Hampshire, they surveyed young people and said, well, what do you want? What do you like? What would make you stay? And affordable housing and open spaces and the beauty and the hiking and the White Mountains and the beach, like all of that came together. Those were two things that people both want, right? And so those really, I don't think they should be in conflict, and I think a lot of good planners, which, you know, you've got one right here, know that they're not in conflict, right? Is that like, it is really inefficient, both from an affordability perspective and from a, you know, how we really want to see our communities if we take that 100 acres and do one house on 1 acre each, or 50 houses on 2 acres. Because one, from an affordability perspective, the land means no one who's, you know, looking for an affordable option can even afford whatever is built on that to begin with. And we've now created more sprawl, which, you know, creates more inefficiencies in terms of transportation and walkability and desirability, and we've gotten rid of the only resource that we can't really get back, which is our, you know, natural resources. Is once you tear it down and build over it, it's not coming back. So figuring out how communities can build affordable options that are dense and retain our, you know, the things that so many of us love about New Hampshire is a real challenge. But I think there's a lot of folks, and I would posit that a lot of folks in the affordable housing community want that. They don't want to just tear everything down and build multifamilies everywhere. They want to maintain this and do it right, right?
Yeah, and just as an example, I mean, if you did build 50 houses on 2 acres, I mean, you've added so many square feet of asphalt to be maintained, right? You've added so much curb that needs to be added. Like, you've added this, like, extra water and sewer infrastructure that needs to be maintained and spread out of that. So you're not helping the final price be lower. You're in fact adding to it and making it more expensive. So I mean, our incentives are aligned in terms of doing it right. You know?
That's great. Thank you. So anyone else on that side? Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Janet Perkins, and I also live in Durham. And please forgive me if this is a definition question, as you mentioned, and forgive me because I did come in late and I'm not sure you went over this, but I do hear these terms about workforce housing, affordable housing. You mentioned income restrictions. definitions. And I'm just a little bit confused as to if we are hopefully trying to diversify our housing and be more equitable about housing overall. How are these defined I think they're somewhat defined in the community that already has a certain per capita income, so that's going to be different somewhere. So how, if we're really trying to diversify that, matching up one community that might have less per capita income, I don't know. Does that question make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And the answer is it's really confusing, so I don't blame you for, or anybody for hearing all the terms and kind of like, what the heck does this mean? I mean, I'll give you sort of a technical answer and like a practical answer. The practical piece is that, we like to talk about it as like attainable housing, because there are some that have, income qualifications, but there's also things that you can build that are naturally occurring within the market, like a duplex, right? And so if you convert one home to 2 homes, and so you're not adding different land space, but you're having 2 families be able to live there, each of those units is going to rent for less than you would potentially rent out that whole house for, right? And so that's an option where it's like you're thinking about that infill piece that the senator mentioned, where there's no income, there's frequently no income restriction, no verification around like how much is that person who's living in the duplex or in the ADU, which is like the in-law sort of apartment, so to speak, like above a garage. There's no necessarily income qualifications for that, but that's like a naturally occurring, attainable housing option. When you come to like the actual definitions piece, there is a state definition for workforce housing, which is 60%, about 60% of the area median income, which then can be broken down into, are you talking about the town's area median income? Are you talking about the HUD median income? And then there's also, affordable, capital A affordable, which can have its own set of definitions around 30%, frequently if it's a federal program. But it really is, it's really confusing, and it's so often determined on what the program that you're looking at actually is, and whether it's a community, like a town that's defined it, whether it's the state that's defined it, whether it's the federal government that's defined it. And so, I don't blame anybody for having this, and that's part of our problem when we're trying to go out and explain this. And Bart mentioned like the language barrier and like the terms and going out and getting into all these myths and misperceptions about what something is because there are so many different definitions and people use it interchangeably, even though it's not always interchangeable. So typically we're talking you think about like affordable from the lowercase perspective is trying to have people not spend more than 30% of their all-in income on housing costs, right? And so what's affordable for one person might not be affordable for another person, but typically that 30% mark is what we're trying to hit. And you may know the numbers, but some of the specifics around how many people in New Hampshire are cost burdened because they're paying more than 30% of their income is I think I've seen some stuff where it's like 40 or 50.
Yeah, it's 45%, right? So if your housing is not affordable to you, and this is like the old rule my dad used to tell me, right? Like 25%. One of your paychecks should go to your rent. Back when we used to get weekly paychecks, and then if you're above that, you're what's called housing burden. So it's in New Hampshire, it's 45% of our population, so almost half of us are paying too much for our housing. If you add in what we call transportation burden, so housing and the cost of maintaining your car because you live like 40 minutes from your job, it's 55% of the state, so over half of us.
So I don't know if that helped at all. But there are some, it's one of those things where it's like, unless you're actually really writing the legislation, it's like we almost think about it too much because there are different programs and like the state just, with the federal funds that came from the American Rescue Plan, they set up this Invest in New Hampshire program. They defined affordable as 80%, and they just created a whole new definition for what they wanted to see as affordable. So, it is really tricky, but, trying to think about how can people access this that are below the area median income, which is a group that is very often overlooked and outpriced when it comes to living in, really desirable communities. And, Newmarket is absolutely one of those, and Durham is one of those, and a lot of the Seacoast is. And so you're in these situations where, if we really want to have those vibrant communities that have everybody here, that both for our economy and working in a lot of the places, whether it's janitors for the schools or service industry or retail, whatever it is, the things that make your economy go and make our economy go, we need diverse housing options. We need housing options that everybody can live in, not just, two families making, $200,000 between the two of them.
Yeah, and so just to kind of, if I can add anything to your original question, I mean, when we're thinking about housing policy, we're trying to think of like sort of layering these tools, and so capital A affordable housing is sometimes like public housing, which tends to target 0 to 60, 0 to 80% of area median income. So in other words, if you make, Portsmouth is 64,000, so if you make, let's say, 45,000 or less, you'll be able to afford putting in capital A, affordable housing. In workforce housing, we're tending to target 60 to 100%. So you're kind of trying to think like how do these things play together, And so when the Portsmouth Housing Authority, for example, just built its new project, it did a mix of market rate and income and covenant restricted units. So it did some units that were just priced however the market priced them, and then it did some that were sort of restricted in these categories, and that means that those will always rent lower, these will always rent higher, and between them they kind of pay for the building. Like the market rate kind of makes up for some of the lost rent that these units have, and that's one of the tools we have available to us in this zoning, is kind of figuring out like how do those numbers and units interplay in a way that brings those housing projects to the table. Like what is the right number, what's the right percentage that that allows those market rate units to kind of make up that revenue flow so that we do see the projects get proposed. So that's part of what we're trying to do.
And from a social service perspective, there's a lot of really good research out there that shows like that mixed income living arrangements is great for everybody, right? It helps people lift out of poverty, it helps people diversify their experiences and their backgrounds and learn different things and learn from our neighbors. And so it really is the best practice from a social science perspective too, and a planning perspective, to have them be intermingled and not just, okay, well here are all of our affordable units and here are all of our market rate units, and they're not gonna cross paths. That's not good for anybody.
Right. Anytime you're saying keep those people over there. It's no longer good housing policy.
Yeah, anyone else, please?
My name is Carol Della. I live in Newmarket. Like prior to coming to Newmarket, I was in town for 29 years. I think that is very familiar with. I've been in Seattle for 29 years, and I had one of those nice little 24 by 34 foot capes that sat on 2.5 acres that I didn't use, and I certainly didn't want to know. So one of my questions, and it's more a wide-reaching one, is one of the issues that I see with the whole concept of affordable housing, however we define it, is that every single town plays by its own rules. We talk about water and sewer, which we know Stratford doesn't have water and sewer. It doesn't have that infrastructure. How, as a region, and it's not, I realize that this is so anti-New Hampshire. I'm just going to
I get this question.
I'll take on that.
I work in the nonprofit world and I deal with transportation issues. So none of these issues sit town by town. We don't know town boundaries. How, even when we talk about policy at the state level, how can we address that? How can we address an issue that will work for Newmarket and Durham and Newfields? I see that as being a huge challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to just say a little bit on this, but thank you for the question, because we don't forget about that. I think there's huge efficiencies there, but at the state level, we wear a lot of hats, and one of the things I do is I sit on the Seacoast Long-Term Commission on Drinking Water, and we have a 10-year charge. And we meet once a month in rotating locations, and we talk about things like how huge this water problem is. And Stratum, for those of you who don't know, is 2/3 private sewer. So it's like almost everybody's on wells and wells and septic. And so, like, we're literally sitting in this room trying to figure this stuff out on a regional level, you know. And so my only answer is that it will take a long time, but we're trying. And I watched this play out. I mean, one of my first votes as a city councilor in Portsmouth was $75 million bond to build our wastewater treatment plants, or upgrade our wastewater treatment plant. And I watched us spend $500 million around Great Bay on upgrading wastewater treatment plants. We couldn't get it together on regional cooperation in that case, but I don't think all is lost. But I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely a challenge. And it's one of those things where I do think we are starting to see some changes where people are starting to realize, okay, like this is really impacting our economy. And that is a motivator. It's a big motivator. And when you start to say, okay, well, I can no longer go to my favorite coffee shop because they don't have enough staff to be open 7 days a week, or, you know, the main employer in our community can't hire and is thinking about leaving. You know, that kind of stuff does get people to move. Right, or get move. Move is probably the wrong word, because move is actually leave, but that gets people to take action, right, and make some different decisions when it comes to sort of their zoning and potential solutions here. So I don't know, it's tough. I mean, you talk to some of the folks in other states that are saying, oh, well, we've got our regional land use board that doesn't really allow the local politics to get into it. They make the decision that fits in the legal description of what's allowed there. And sort of say, well, that's not a solution that would work here. And I do think it is one of those things where we do have to be based in reality. And I think one of the things that you learn working at the State House or being a state legislator trying to get things through is how do you build a coalition that can actually make some progress? And where are the common ground? And there are certain things I think we would both love to see that are probably never going to happen in New Hampshire. And you know, it's okay to push for some of them, but it's also important to be realistic about what we can get done, because there's a lot of people that are depending on us making some progress. And if we're able to get a handful more units on one of these towns that doesn't have public water and sewer, because we're able to do some cottage clusters or relax an ADU ordinance or something, like that is progress. And it's not a solution, but it is something that, you know, we have to think about and work towards. So I don't know. It's a tough one though. That's a good question.
But I did just want to add like one more note of caution around regional and housing, because I do very much support us cooperating, and I think it would be great if we did. But I also want us to avoid this pitfall thinking that, like, you know, housing is one place's problem and, you know, other places provide jobs or other places provide schools, you know. And I'm not saying you're implying anything like that, but I hear it in Portsmouth. And, you know, I've always said, and I said this since the beginning, I think it's in each town's best interest to welcome as many people in as they possibly can, because I think your people are your asset. You know, like, the people that are trying to move into your community bring their new perspective. You know, they might bring their teleworking income, or they might bring their, you know, awesome kids as part of your school district, or they might bring their different perspective from another place in the country. And I think our towns and cities that don't do that, you know, are going to find that they're stagnating. And so I always like put my ear up when I hear regional, because I think it's been used in a context that's like, well, we do this, we'll put the housing somewhere else, you know, and I just think it's a loss. I mean, I think it's a loss for Portsmouth every time someone moves somewhere else. I think it's a loss for the Seacoast when I lose people. So, you know, just my little team pitch.
Yeah, and there's one community, and I won't name them, but that we're working in, and they reached out because they were having a hard time plowing roads in the wintertime, because the person who drove the plow, and it's a small enough town where there's only a handful of people that do drive the plows, the person who worked for the DPW who did a lot of that was too far away, and like snow would fall, and it would take them a long time to get in, and it would take a long time to plow the roads. And so they were finally like, okay, we need to think about housing. And it's like, okay, well, I'm glad you got there. But it is true. It's like it got to a point where it's like, okay, we finally made the connection between this is impacting us in our day-to-day lives, and we need to figure out a way to work on this, right? And it's okay. I mean, that would led up to call us and say, how do we start to sit down and work on some things that may allow for more affordable options in the community. So take the wins where you can get them, and sort of making it personal and tell those stories helps.
Yeah, I'm just also noticing maybe it's an opportunity for some nonprofit or some organization to help municipalities communicate, maybe facilitate a joint municipal agreement, whatever issues that the neighboring towns have, kind of facilitate that. There's no legislative mechanism to allow for a regionalism approach, then, maybe there's opportunities to have joint municipal agreements, which is, between the two municipalities themselves, which is my understanding legal, so, at this point, so yeah, an opportunity, there, to collaborate. Anyone else looking?
My name is John Stiper. I own a restaurant on the other end of town, and as is every restaurant, struggling to hire. And it was kind of funny because about a year ago, I called an immigration attorney who was looking to sponsor someone from another country. And then I realized where they live. And it's kind of funny because I think we all sort of know that there's a housing problem, but I still talk to people in my day-to-day who have this mentality of like, well, I've got my house and like Newmarket's full, And I don't think they quite understand like what would happen if we just stopped building housing. And just that half my employees now are in high school or under 18 because that's who is here to work. I think I'm paying pretty well, so we're $20 an hour, and that doesn't seem to be the issue. There's just literally no one showing up to apply for the jobs. And it just seems that people don't really realize that we can't just stop, And I don't know, and I've heard that from people of different age groups, and they say, oh, you an adult, like, oh, they're doing all this, building, like, I hate it, it's all changing. How do we kind of overcome that feeling of I don't want my town, I don't want my town to change, but at the same time, people obviously, I still feel like there's some people that don't understand why that's important.
So it's maybe rephrase the question. Why is change hard? What clashes all those roadblocks to uncertainty is just not understanding. I don't know, in your experiences,
Geez, it's such a hard question, and I think if we had the answer, we'd millionaires and, all the problems would be solved. I like to use my mom as a bellwether. So my mom is 71, she lives in Stratton, she's in a condo. And, we had lived in our housing project for 33 years. And she was ready to move and ready to downsize. And this was 2018. And I got involved in housing in 2008. So she looks all over the Seacoast for a condo, and she turns to me one day over dinner and she's like, man, housing really is hard to find. Mom, I've only been spending every waking hour for 10 years working on this issue. But I use it for bellwether in other circumstances, and I'll always remember some of the initial times that I would come back with these Portsmouth City Council issues, and I'd be like, well, we're trying to lower the parking space requirement for new housing to make it less expensive. If it's a micro unit or a studio, then it should only require 0.5 or 0 parking spaces. And she's like, well, where are people going to park, And we talked about it for 5 minutes, and she's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And so I kind of try to remember those conversations when I'm talking to anybody, because it's how I grew up, A, so I guess I'm used to it. But B, it mirrors, I think, sometimes, I don't know your experience or yours, the public process. There needs to be something out there for people to react to, but they do need to react to it, and they do need the opportunity to process it. They need the opportunity to poke at it, to ask questions, to see if they want it as part of their community, to kind of look at it from all sides and see if there's a Trojan horse in there or something. But I've come to realize that's a good thing. That's that's an opportunity for us to have that conversation as a community, and it's not always obstructionist. I mean, it's like very often full of people who just don't spend all their waking hours thinking about housing, like some of us do, you know? And so I think just acknowledging that is important. But I also heard this quote once that leadership is creating change at a pace that people can get used to. And I stick with that because that pace might be slow, but you're not going to get anything done faster than that, you know? And you need to kind of bring everybody with you. And so I guess I think that trying to understand that wages have gone up 20% in the past 15 years and housing prices have gone up 1,300% makes this a different problem than when my mom and dad were young and they were raising their kids. It's different and it is more extreme. And, you know, everything is more expensive. And so it's not a question of this one-time surge in wages that we have right now, you know. It needs to be sustainable, and you know, I think helping people sort of think about, like, who's going to take over your dental practice, you know, like who's going to take over your legal practice, who's going to take over your engineering, your accounting, your family bakery, like you know, just, it's like there's this whole generation of people. Who's going to take over your city council seat, or your select board seat, or your planning board seat? There's, you know, New Hampshire has this older average age, and so as we look behind us, it's like somebody has to be coming up, and somebody has to be able to be a part of this community and live here, you know. So I've always found success just kind of saying, like, we need density, you know, but I do think you can connect with people, whether it's through the sort of like shared interest of economic survival, or whether it's because they truly value diversity, or whether it's because they don't want their school costs per capita to go up, and so you need to be maintaining continuing steady enrollment at minimum. And if you don't, you're going to see your capital costs go up and up per student. You know, I mean, I think there's a variety of ways to present the issue that are personal, but I have not found very much success just being like, or housing, you know. So I guess that's kind of the hard work I feel like I've been trying to do for 15 years, but I don't know.
No, I mean, it's absolutely tough, right? But I do think that telling the stories and you know, obviously one of the reasons why I thank you all for being here is that you'll go talk to your friends and share, and it's hard work, but it's like that extra, that community organizing, that social, that political pressure, that political will, was telling those stories, because we could sit here and say, you know, the rental vacancy rate is 0.5%, and, you know, for sale inventory on the market is 2 months, which is below 6 months, which is healthy, and rental rates have gone up 26% in 5 years. But like, what does that mean, right? Like, it doesn't mean anything. But then, you know, saying I can only hire high school kids because there's no one else who lives here who could who will work, you know, at a good wage for a good job for a place people love to go to, right? Like, those kind of stories move people so much more than just throwing a bunch of numbers at them. And that community organizing is hard work, right? And it is, I mean, it really is. And so, you know, one of the things that we try to do as our nonprofit is we launch this Where We Live series, which is a bunch of tours. Like, we go see diverse housing options, bring people with us, and say, let's go look at your residential manufactured home communities. Let's look at dense housing in downtown. We did a walking tour in downtown Exeter. We did a bus tour of manufactured housing in Newmarket and Dover. We did the trip to the Portsmouth Housing Authority's new building and actually say, let's go see it, right? Like, let's break down some of the stigma around, like, what is this kind of housing, and go see it for yourself. Talk to people that live there and, like, hear their stories, because then that person, when they go back and maybe they're a selectman, maybe they're a planning board member, maybe they have to make a vote on whether to approve a variance for this dense housing development, they'll hopefully remember those people that they met, those stories that they heard. Because too often, a lot of these meetings where people make some of these decisions, or even some of the boards, their own lived experience is just different. And that's kind of the reality of the situations. Maybe they were able to buy their single-family home with their savings, and it was, you know, they were able to work a couple years, save it up, and put a down payment on, and buy their single-family home. But the reality is that's not like today's economy, and that can be tough for people to realize who aren't back in it, right? And we hear it sometimes from people that say, you know, man, like my kid just graduated from college, they have a great job, but they can't find a place to live. And it's like, okay, you know, there's other people that, you know, glad, again, this is kind of like, I'm glad, like the story I was talking about, the plow community, is like, all right, I'm glad you finally made it there. Like, wish it didn't have to take you, your personal hardship, for you to realize that this should be a community impact, but sometimes it does, right? And so telling those stories and making that connection, I think, is really important. So, you know, I appreciate you coming and telling your story, and, you know, we can connect afterwards. We're happy to help you try and tell it more, right? And so if we do put some things forward at the State House, figuring out how do we make sure that that committee room, when those legislators are making that decision, is full of people who can tell real life stories about, you know, the real New Hampshire and the real struggles. And that just makes it harder and harder to say no to change, because it has a face, it has a story, and it's tough, but that's what it's going to take.
Hi, my name is Carrie, and I live in Newmarket. My question is, are there any solutions to not just the issue of quantity, but also quality of housing? Because I know that, like, I have a couple of friends that are our age, and they're moving out of this area because not only because they cannot find affordable housing, but affordable housing that isn't, like, falling apart. Like, you can afford a house that's lonely, or you can afford a house that's, you know, standing farther up north or to the west. I guess that's my question.
Sorry to answer that. So there, you know, through the initial process of when projects being permitted, there's design guidelines on that a municipality can enact in order to when review and use those to review. So you have what's called projects. There's also a property maintenance code that a town can adopt, but that can be contentious too sometimes, because then municipalities are leasing properties. So that's really a conversation municipality has to have with itself. To what extent does the town want the town government to go out and lease properties? There's also health code violations that are on the books already that if there's a complaint, the health officer will go out and investigate. So there will be, you know, life safety issues, you know, mold and whatnot. So
the other aspect is how to keep it affordable. So they fix up the house, and then they raise the rent $600, and you can't afford it.
right. So again, you know, through that permitting process, there was a ordinance in place that mandated that some of these units are deed restricted to be affordable, then they would have to stay affordable for however long time they're restricted. So if there's no mechanism in place, then it's up to the landowner, the property owner, unless there's other agencies where there's grant funding that the landowner can pursue in order to keep things affordable. So it's really, it's a whack-a-mole. But I think what the town can do is hold agencies to enact such an ordinance. After having those conversations, you know, how does this town want to regulate affordable housing, or at least provide space for it always.
Yeah, no, and I would also add that I do think this does come back to some respect to supply, right? Is that because the supply is so low, you're seeing some landlords, not all, but some landlords be able to say, okay, I can just raise the price to whatever. People are going to pay it because they can't find anywhere else, and they don't want to take their kids out of school. They don't want to lose their job. And so that's leading to people being able to kind of charge whatever they want, because there is no supply. And if we had the supply, then people would be able to healthily move around and say, look, if you're not going to fix this up, or you're not going to get rid of the bed bugs or the infestation or whatever, the mold, then I'm going to go move someplace else. And like that's what in a healthy rental market, or a healthy market generally, you're able to do, right? Is that you have you have a price that is affordable to the market. You have people be able to move around, that if it's not being maintained the way it should be, then they can find some other place. But we are so out of whack with what our supply is like that you do have people that are going to put up with things that they really shouldn't have to put up with, both from a health perspective and from sort of a market perspective, but they do because we haven't built units. And so, I do think it's kind of two-pronged, like Bart said, in some of these cases we do need to go in, but we're also seeing places where people buy them and say, all right, well, this is I was able to buy it cheap because it's so run down, I'm gonna evict everyone that lives there and, rebuild it up in a way that's now luxury apartments, right? And so that's causing its own set of issues where it's like, yes, we absolutely should rehab some of this, but you also shouldn't be in a situation where, that means everyone's getting evicted, because it is, but it's really tough. We saw this in Salem, there was a building that was purchased and everyone was evicted. They said they're needed to be up to code or need to be built back up. But then you had hundreds of people who were now searching for an affordable option in this market who had been in this place for some people 10 years, right? And it's like, it's really tough. But I do think it comes back to a supply issue. If you had a healthy supply, then you'd be able to actually move around. But again, that's not the only tool in the toolkit.
Thank you for your question. Anyone else like to speak? Sure. I think after Nancy speaks, we'll probably just close the dots.
I'm curious how climate change enters into the housing conversation, because I know, for example, like an electric car costs more up front, but in the long run, it's a cheaper car to own. And I imagine it's the same with housing. So how do we bring that, like, affordable housing might be cheap housing, but maybe not in the long run cheaper, so.
I got a couple thoughts on that. So I think reuse of existing structures. Reuse of existing structures. So rehab. You think about construction, the energy used to build a house. It's the wood in Canada. Coming down. What's the energy cost to bring that wood down? All the energy used to build that house is up front in construction. So if we have the ability to reuse existing structures, that'll save a lot of climate impact, I think. So looking at opportunities to do that, I think is a great way to reduce the energy impact of housing. And then it's for new housing density. You can get smaller or less geographic area, less geographic part where you're using to build it for the development. I think that is that we have for that carbon sinkhole, for all the trees and whatnot to maintain. So I don't know if anyone else has thoughts.
Yeah, there's also some interesting and exciting work starting to come in around, the intersection of building and energy, which is cool because I work day to day in renewables and I'm a huge project renewable side, so I think it's fun. But in general, when you're talking about affordable housing, like pieces, it's just sort of the cost on a monthly basis, right? It's more efficient, the lower your sort of like R value or your loss of energy in your home is, the lower your utility costs will be. And so a lot of the sort of like new beneficial electrification pieces and stuff, just kind of getting people off of gas onto other forms of heat, like heat pumps. A lot of those investments are coming, and some of what we can do at the state and local level is encourage, especially modern building codes. So like the 2018 building code, a lot of energy efficient stuff in there. But there's even starting to be some cool like policy innovations around. That just left me. Sort of around sort of the similar model to what you see in utility programs for modernization, but basically like building off of the LEED type ideas. If you build your building to a certain point, it's sort of efficiency or weatherization standard that you'd be able to take advantage of zoning incentives, for example, or kind of like trying to combine some of the policy flows in ways that are interesting. But it's I think what Bart said is right? Ultimately, there's something like 10% of your energy costs or 10% of the energy usage. So there's some really powerful impacts through the built environment that we can kind of change that. I think we're really starting to see a lot of innovation there.
So if there's no one, I hope you know it, right?
Leslie McCarthy, I live in Newmarket. I did live in Perkins for 2 years, all 10 years, until I had to leave because my duplex was turned into a company, and I couldn't stay. So I have a question. There's a lot of new builds in Portsmouth and some in Newmarket, and I don't see them as being affordable. Is there any affordable housing being constructed today in either town?
Not in the Newmarket, I guess that's Beaver Street. Yeah, I can't speak for Portsmouth.
Well, we found, yeah, I know, like, so we did start to see, maybe for COVID, we did start to see a little bit of new supply softening or prices in the market, but that was just with the market rate. The only new income restricted units that have been built are the ones in West End yards. But like I said, I think that if,
Those are affordable.
well, there's some that are
$1,800.
the market rate was there, right? I know, sorry. I know. I'm not gonna sit here and tell you, but,
Patriots Park is affordable, but it's not really material.
Yep. So, I mean, we had heard a statistic a lot of times that, Portland, for example, had built like 1% new housing per year for the past 20 years. That have been closer to maintaining sort of lower prices. So there's a lot of catching up to do. And, we haven't seen population growth, which is another thing that hurts our city. So is there anything constructed today? No, I cannot say yes to the question, but it's my great hope that we continue to work on this. That will be it.
I just saw that 56 housing project on Perkins road start to get $900,000. And it's gonna be, they're gonna have a homeowner association fees on top of it. Well, it's a cluster.
And I would add too, is one of the things that we hear, and I would consider this a myth in some respects, is that any new housing on the market is gonna help everybody, right? And that to some, like if you got to a point that you had a balanced market, okay, sure, you could make that argument. But right now, there is such a demand to move here that if you're building, some of these $900,000 condos, people are gonna come in and take them. And it's not gonna free up, it's not necessarily, unless you're, in some cases we've seen where you build enough, in some of these communities it has dropped a little bit, but really we do need to make sure that there are some guardrails and some incentives, and the way, whether it's like density bonuses where communities are able to add more units, but some have to be income restricted, or like you get to, have more buildable land or more land with, units per acre or anything like that. There does need to be some restrictions in place because you do hear it that people they're coming in and say, oh, we'll build 100 luxury apartments, like more units will drop down the price. And it's like, well, if these are all luxury apartments, like it's not really going to make a huge impact. And sure, there's a little bit of, okay, maybe there may be somebody that moves up to one of those units and it frees up a lower unit, but we're not really at that level, right? And so it is really tough, and that's absolutely a challenge. And so we're kind of fighting two fights here almost. And it's like we got to get some more units on the market, but we also have to make sure that they're not all luxury units. And one of the things that we do as our nonprofit is when we're talking about working with communities or talking to a developer or working on a potentially project or doing community engagement in a region that may have a project, we're not just going to say yes to everything. We're not just going to say like, okay, we'll come in and do some listening sessions about the housing market unless you do have an affordability component. And so figuring out how we can do some of those things, but it's really tough because that's exactly right. You see a lot of things go up, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're at a stage where it's gonna immediately come down.
So I guess on that note, my last question to you both, are you hopeful? We're What are you seeing out there
Um,
that makes you go for it?
Yeah, well, I guess just, going back to the beginning, like, when I started talking about housing and zoning, I mean, nobody was paying attention. I felt like I would open my mouth and people were like, you know, so it's really nice for me to see you guys are here. It's nice for me to hear their businesses are engaged. It's unfortunate because it means the problem has gotten that bad and we haven't solved it, but I think the fact that we're seeing this all over the country, you know, we are not alone. And reurbanization has been a big national trend, and so figuring out how to manage cities anew in our generation is something that, like, we're all learning together. So I am hopeful. I think we're learning a lot of cool tools, and change will happen at a pace that we can all get used to. But you know, I do see a place where you know, even municipal sounds, you know, you're coming up through a place where you're going to know more about this than the generation before you. So I think we'll tackle it.
Yeah, I would agree. I am hopeful because I do think we're having more and more conversations, and we're having people who are reaching out saying, what can we do? And you have policymakers who, some of these communities who have not really tackled housing in a long time, or have said, well, that's not our problem, who said, okay, it is. It is our problem now, and what can we do about it? And you know, I echo the same point. Like, it's a little disappointing that it got to this point that we're having to do this, but you know, it does mean that we're starting to make some progress, and we're hearing it in conversations, we're hearing it in tone shifts. So you know, hopefully by the time we're doing this next year, we're able to point to some things that are actually getting constructed, some changes that have allowed us to move forward. And I'll make a quick other plug. I do have some books there that people are free to take, and I've got a bunch more. I didn't even put them all out on the table, but it's Communities and Consequences. It's a book from local authors out in New Hampshire. We're also doing a film screening, documentary screening, Wednesday morning, breakfast. You can get a free breakfast sandwich and coffee. It's at the Brook in Seabrook, so it's a little bit of a drive, but it's Communities and Consequences too. It's an hour. We have the filmmaker there who's going to talk a little bit about what went into producing the documentary. So if you're interested in that, talk to me afterwards. But you know, again, thank you all for coming out. And,